So we've done fatigue, now we've got to recover from activity. So this is what we're looking at in this slideshow, lesson, whatever you want to call it. So how do we do this? It involves several things, okay? It involves the replenishment of ATP and phosphocreatine stores or PC stores. We have to break down, we have to remove the lactic acid, we have to refuel and restore the glycogen stores in the muscle, the liver. We have to rehydrate, so all that water that's been lost through sweating, we have to replace that, and the electrolytes, we've got to replace those. And then we also need to repair and regenerate any tissue that may have been damaged during exercise. So they're not necessarily the steps that you have to take or that the body follows, but that's what's involved in recovery. So let's look at each of them. So the active recovery, we've spoken about these in the past. It's basically a cool down. It's that, that period of activity after your event or whatever it might be. The teacher says to you, okay, you've run the beep test, don't sit down. Okay, go for a walk, go get a drink, come back, don't sit down. And the reason we say that is because it's an important part. It helps remove the lactic acid and all the byproducts if you've been working anaerobically, and it basically speeds up the recovery process. It also prevents venous pooling. So we see here the term venous pooling. If you don't know what venous pooling is, and I'll draw a little diagram here, right? We have our oversized vein. The thing about veins is they don't have as much pressure as what an artery does. Okay, the blood's on its way back to the heart. Okay, so it's not being pumped out with all that much force. So what it has to rely on is, wow, that is a terrible muscle. Okay, we have our muscles here, all right, and then there's another one on the other side. Oh, it's getting even worse. It's terrible. All right, well, you get the gist anyway. Basically what happens is, as these muscles are contracting and squeezing on our artery, on our vein, and I'm going to get rid of my muscle because it's just woeful, okay? As those muscles are contracting, our deoxygenated blood, the blue stuff, right, that is a bad arrow, goes through these gates, and I know I'm sure I've spoken about it in the past. They go through the gates, like those gates that you see at like Coles and Woolworths and all the supermarkets and retail stores and that sort of stuff, okay? They're designed to let people in, but they don't let people out. So basically what happens, if we were to not do an active recovery and perform a passive recovery, some of this blood, as it's flowing through, is just going to sit here and pool. It's just going to make a puddle. Okay, so there's lactic acid that's sitting there in the blood, and it's just pooling there. And that's not good for the recovery. It means that it's going to take a lot longer to remove all those waste products. So that elevated period of 5, 10, 15 minutes after exercise when you're performing an active recovery, it aids in the removal of that, okay? Because those muscles, those really badly drawn muscles that are on the side here, they keep contracting, they keep contracting, they keep forcing the blood through. So it's getting all that blood back to the heart where it can be reoxygenated and then pumped around the body again. All right. You'll also generally do some sort of stretching, which will aid in the recovery as well. So our passive recovery is the exact opposite of what the active recovery is. It's simple as that. So you got two, you got active and you got passive. The passive recovery is the one that we want to do if we're trying to replenish our ATP stores, because if you remember, as long as you're active, PC is being consumed and it won't replenish until the body has a sufficient period of rest or low intensity activity where it can replenish itself. The PC fuel recovery, can't speak this morning. It gets restored really quickly. We've talked about this in the past, but if you look at the table here, it's 30 seconds to get 70% of your PC stores back. Okay, that's provided that you're not doing anything. Okay, so a passive recovery. You can see the table there. It varies, dependent on how much time you spend resting as to how much will be restored. So generally they say almost 100% at 3 minutes, so it's 180 seconds, they get 98%, but then that last 2%, that tiny last little bit, it's going to take another 7 minutes. So if you want full restoration of PC, and obviously this depends on a number of other factors, 10 minutes is going to be sort of the amount. Like we said, it needs to be complete rest or very low activity. Generally, people going for PC fuel recovery, it is just sitting there doing a passive recovery. And it's really important that you use the correct terminology when you're talking in terms of SACs and exams and that sort of thing. Okay, so it's passive recovery. This other graph here basically shows the impact of not doing a full recovery. So in this instance, it says that 15 seconds rest conducted by a netball center player, not to scale. Okay, so what's happened is they've had 15 seconds of rest. So it's not going to be a complete restoration of PC. 15 seconds, let's say, you're going to get maybe 60, maybe 70% rest, depends on a number of factors. But gradually what's going to happen over time is this line is going to go from up here and it's going to trend down. Eventually they'll run out and they'll be working more anaerobically using the anaerobic glycolysis system as opposed to the ATP PC. So it gets replenished from two sources. Okay, it gets replenished from the liver and their amino acids within the liver, and it also comes from dietary creatine, which is found in red meats. Trouble is, low pH levels can impact the body's ability to restore from these sources. So things that cause low pH, I'll give you a second to think about it. The anaerobic glycolysis system, that changes the pH levels in the body, okay, because the hydrogen ions, the lactate, they all impact on the pH levels. Okay, so having a high level of aerobic capacity is going to help you because it means that it can metabolize all those byproducts from the anaerobic glycolysis system a lot quicker, which means recovery will also happen a lot quicker. So the next part of recovery is looking at the blood glucose and the glycogen, the muscle glycogen, and how we restore that. Okay, so the body uses glucose. We use it at a rate of about 1 gram of glucose a minute. Okay, and that's working at 60% of your max heart rate. So the effects of the glycogen depletion, we can minimize that. We can reduce let's say how badly they deplete by having a diet that's high in carbohydrates before exercise, before training. So that's the carbohydrate loading that we've spoken about in the past. So the more glucose you have in your system, the better off you'll be. So that's why people doing endurance events, they will do something like carbohydrate loading prior to the event. So they've got more stores to minimize that depletion at the end of the event. So how do we replenish? Well, the examples here are good ways of doing it. So what you should be aiming to do is in the first 30 minutes of recovery, you should be aiming to consume about 1 gram per kilogram. So if a person weighs 60 kilos, then they'd be aiming to have 60 grams of some form of glucose, like carbohydrates, high GI foods, to refuel. Hypertonic drinks, they're really good in the sense that they will also, they'll refuel, but they'll also rehydrate. Okay, you'll you'll replenish those stores of electrolytes and water and all that sort of stuff that has been lost through sweating and also through exercise. The other thing that you should be having at that time as well is lots of proteins. Proteins obviously help with the muscle repair, but there is also a window where the insulin sensitivity is increased, and it's usually after exercise. So by having protein, it will force the liver to take up as much of the glycogen as it can and store it for later on, and then the muscles will go from there. So protein as well, and then after that first 30 minute, then you would top up with any sort of carbohydrates, and it can take a while. It can take 24 hours longer. It depends on how much was depleted at the end of the event as to how long it takes to replenish all those stores. So like I've already said in that previous slide, that the most important time in terms of recovery is that first 30 minutes after you've finished. So the muscles are going to be more receptive to restoring that glycogen that's been used. So they'll do it that little bit more efficiently. So normally what you would do is you would have high GI foods, again, like I said in the previous slide, you would have those as soon as possible, ideally within the first couple of hours, to kickstart that process. And then over the course of the next 24 hours or longer, you would keep, just consuming carbohydrates to replenish those stores. Then you'd also have the proteins for repairing the damaged muscles. And when we say damaged, they're not damaged as such, but it's that delayed onset of muscular soreness. So, those microscopic tears, that's what that, you let's say first time running for 12 months, or the first time playing cricket, or whatever it might be, for however long, and you wake up a couple of days after, or maybe the day after, you're like, oh my God, geez, that's really sore, from where I rolled my arm over, because they're muscles that haven't been used in that long, in that sort of fashion, that there's tiny little microscopic tears. So that's where the protein comes into it and is really handy for repairing it. So like I said, full glycogen recovery, it can take a few days. It depends on how much has been depleted in the first place. So it may also depend on the duration and how high was your intake in the first place. If it wasn't particularly high, then yes, it will take longer to replenish those stores. So other methods that you can use for recovery, you may have seen some of these in the past. You may have heard about going and getting massage. You may have heard about hot and cold showers or contrast therapy, because there's that contrast between the hot and the cold. And the idea is that, like, you get into the cold water, and we're talking like ice baths, freezing cold water with ice, and it's that shock of getting into that cold water. I mean, I'm sure you've all sort of jumped into cold baths, cold swimming pools, gone to the beach in, sort of a summer day that's not particularly hot. you've you've had that shock of, oh my God, that's so cold. So an acute response to that is the heart rate, it increases, it starts beating faster, pumps more blood around. So it's pushing more blood around the body, and then you've got the hot, and it's that contrast and the constant going between hot and cold that shocks the system, and it forces the blood around, and it just helps with the removal of all the waste products. You've heard about kind of spas, doing stretching, pool sessions. Pool sessions are really good because they're low impact. Walking the ocean like these guys are doing. You might have also heard about RICEs, which rest, ice, compression, elevation, referral, all that sort of stuff. And then IV hydration, which has been controversial in some applications.